From back in the day has a recipe for a perfect marriage. Here's his 13 points for a perfect marriage. Number 1, 2 times a week, we go to a nice restaurant, have a little beverage, good food, and companionship. She goes on Tuesdays, I go on Fridays. Number 2, we also sleep in separate beds. Hers is in California, and mine is in Texas. Number 3, I take my wife everywhere, but she keeps finding her way back. Number 4, I asked my wife where she wanted to go for our anniversary. Somewhere I haven't been in a long time, she said. I told her, the kitchen. Number 5, we always hold hands. If I let go, she shops. Number 6, she has an electric blender, an electric toaster, an electric bread maker. She said there are too many gadgets and no place to sit down, so I bought her an electric chair. Number 7, my wife told me the car wasn't running well because there was water in the carburetor. I asked her where the car was. She said, the lake. 8, she got a mud pack the other day and she looked good for 2 days. Then the mud fell off. Number 9, she ran after the garbage truck yelling, am I too late for the garbage? The driver said, no, jump on in. Number 10, remember that marriage is the number 1 cause for divorce. Number 11, I married Miss Wright. I just didn't know her first name was Always. Number 12, I haven't spoke to my wife in 18 months. I don't want to interrupt her. Number 13, the last fight was my fault though. My wife asked, what's on the TV? I said, dust. You can tell from the presentation that there has been different philosophies of marriage through the years. This is kind of old school jokes that a husband and wife might make about each other. We go through a phase where marriage was like very, very, very important. And today we come to marriage and it is casual. And holding those vows are considered very low priorities in a person's life. And making it till death do us part rarely happens. So over the last kind of 5 or 6 weeks, we've looked at this idea of what are some maybe things we need to change in our relationships, maybe even personally, so that our marriage will make it till death do us part. And for part 1, we said, what happens when we no longer think the right person is the right person anymore? When the right person is no longer the right person because maybe we're not feeling it anymore. The heart's not beating so fast. The feelings in the gut not quite there. There's no more walking in the clouds. And we said, when we kind of limit our definition of love to just feelings and emotions, it's an immature love. So we have to mature our definition so that we define love as selfless sacrifice. That love is selfless sacrifice. In part 2, we said there was one thing that you have to have in marriage to make it till death do us part, and it's forgiveness. Because forgiveness fosters forever. Forgiveness fosters forever. We said in our marriages, we tend to grow apart. And when we grow apart and we disconnect, sometimes there's another person that kind of pops up in the relationship that causes us not to make it till death do us part. So how do we overcome the gap of growing apart? And we said we spend time with each other. Quality time, because time tames temptation. Time tames temptation. Then we looked at this argument where sacrifice and submission go hand in hand in a relationship. So the husband sacrifices for the wife, and the wife submits to the husband. And the wife sacrifices for the husband, and the husband submits to the wife. And the idea was that after we say I do, it's not about you. After you say I do, it is no longer about you. In part 5, Brother Tom brought this idea of what causes divorces, what causes separation in the relationship, and it's the hardness of heart. And when we have a hardness of heart, it breaks God's heart and it destroys marriages. Hardness of heart breaks God's heart and destroys marriages. And today we're going to look at this idea that we all get distracted. We all get distracted in our relationships. And sometimes that's caused by work. Sometimes it's caused by a hobby. Sometimes it's caused by maybe a drug or an alcohol or some type of an addiction. Sometimes the distraction comes from another person. Sometimes the distraction even comes from our spouse. And this distraction will hurt the marriage, but it will also hurt our relationship with God. And maybe one of the things that is overlooked in terms of our marriage relationship, one thing that might be the number one thing that distracts us the most, is the idea of sex. It's the idea of sex. Something that is kind of taboo to talk about in church world. But today we're going to tackle a few things related to this idea. So what about sex in the marriage relationship, or even in our relationship with God? There's a group of people at the Church of Corinth that was having some issues in this area. Many of the folk kind of thought that was a bad thing. That if you're going to be spiritual, you couldn't be sexual. So they sent the questions to the Apostle Paul. And he said, okay, Paul, what about the sexual relationship between a husband and wife? And in chapter 7, and we're going to kind of jump through chapter 7 because later, this is a preview, next year, probably February and March, we're going to have time spent on the idea of divorce and remarriage. A lot of what happens in this chapter has to do with divorce and remarriage. I don't want to tackle it all today, so we're going to come back to it back in February and March. But Paul asked this question, Paul was asked this question, what about the sexual relationship? And guys, honestly, verse 1, you're not going to like the answer in what he says. Chapter 7, verse 1 says, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Man, I'm sorry. But as I read that, I almost have this Bill Clinton flashback from back in the 90s for some of the way he says this. But as we go through this chapter, the reason he says this is because he thinks the marriage relationship, he thinks the sexual relationship can distract someone from serving God. He thinks that relationship can distract someone in their relationship with God. So almost in a way he's saying, be careful how you interact in this way. And if you're strong enough to say no, don't. So you can have a solid, focused relationship with God. But he knows you better than you know yourself. So he comes at verse 2 and says, but since sexual immorality is occurring, that sex outside of marriage was going on, that the husband were having more than one partner, that the women were even going outside this, he knew that sex was a big deal and could be a distraction in the marriage relationship and the spiritual relationship. He says each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman should have sexual relationships with her own husband. His point, sex in marriage is a good thing, but it's not the most important thing. Sex in marriage is a good thing between a husband and wife, but it's not the most important thing. He keeps going in verse 5, and he says, do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Now, this kind of totally changes the excuses we use. Maybe we don't say, I have a headache. Maybe we should say, I think we need to pray. Here's why. The only spiritual should stop the sexual. Only the spiritual should stop the sexual. And honestly, it's because the sexual is a spiritual thing too, because it was designed by God. And we have to be careful with it. That's why he says, verse 5. The reason, after you kind of postpone the relationship because of prayer, he says, but then you come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. He knows that if we don't have a healthy physical life, a healthy sexual life, it's going to be very hard for us to have a healthy spiritual life because we all get distracted. We all get distracted. A husband and wife, they were taking a walk, and they were kind of holding hands, and the lady was talking. And after every 2 or 3 words, the husband would just change the subject, start talking about something else. He was kind of having like a squirrel moment. And she said, you have such a rough time staying focused. And he says, I do not. I can focus. So she challenged him. She goes, okay, let's walk for 5 minutes. And for 5 minutes, I want you to pray in your heart about our spiritual life and our life altar. So he said, okay, I'll take you up on that. She says, if you're able to do it, I will take you down to the Dairy Queen and I will buy you a banana split. He says, you're on. So they're holding hands and they're walking. 2 minutes goes by. He looks at his wife and he says, hey, can I have 2 cherries on that banana split? Didn't stay focused. We all get distracted. Verse 8 and 9, Paul keeps going. Now, to the unmarried and to the widows. Now, when he says unmarried, he really means those people who have never had a spouse. There's a difference between people who have been lifelong singles and those who have been widowed. He says, now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried. Why? So they can stay focused on God. So they can have a single-minded focus on God. That's why he said this is one of the repetitive things here. And then he kind of blows in our minds here, as I do. Now, maybe the Apostle Paul was a widower, or maybe he devoted his life to serving God in a way that did not open the door or even have room for a spouse. Interesting thought. Sometimes we don't think of Paul that way. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. But he gives us a cool lesson here. Paul actually says being single is okay. Being single is okay. But we don't normally think of singleness as a good thing, even though Paul did. Here's the reasons we don't think singleness is good. Because one, the world, the culture, tells us to be coupled. The culture tells us to be coupled. Everywhere you go, you see couples and couples and couples. Singleness is kind of like looked down on. If you don't have a spouse, you're like, well, what's wrong with you? Like that is really the mindset of the culture. But Paul goes, being single is okay. Sometimes we don't want to be single because of loneliness. Because of loneliness. There was a survey done just last year that said 3 out of 5 people are scared of being lonely. They are scared of being lonely. We are made really to be in community. That's the way God made us. So it's natural not to want to be single. But one of the reasons we don't think it's good, even though Paul says it, is that ego. Now here's where ego comes in the marriage relationships. You know, we all are wired a certain way. We all have things we like, things we dislike. There's something in us that wants to be accepted. We want to have somebody look at us and go, you're okay. And man, when we find that one person that can look past all of our faults, all of our sins, all of our bad habits, and love us anyway, that's what we want. But it's also playing to our ego. We have to be careful there. Security, wanting to have someone, maybe it's financial security. Maybe it's just the physical security of having someone to come home to than sex. But Paul said being single is okay. Verse 28, because he knew something. This is one of the funniest verses in the Bible. He knew something about marriage. Chapter 7, verse 28 says, those who marry will face many troubles. Everybody say many troubles. Y'all did not do that good. Y'all were scared. Let's try it again. Say many troubles. Many troubles. Man, if you've been married for 2 minutes, you know that marriage comes with a bunch of problems. You know why? Because you have a bunch of problems. You brought them into the relationship. Then you met someone else who had a bunch of problems. So you doubled the problems just by getting married. And Paul knew this. He knew it was going to be a struggle. And he's like, hey, I want to spare you this. I just crack up when I read this verse. This is one of those cool verses in the Bible that we just got to fly past. But Paul knew that being single allowed us to be focused on God. And whenever we get two sinners together, it causes problems and trouble. There's this husband and wife. They got to the point where they were fighting, so they just decided they would not talk to each other. And the husband had a business trip, and he actually needed his wife to wake him up at 5:30 the next morning so he wouldn't miss a plane. But he did not want to be the first one to speak. So he gets a little sticky note, and he writes on it, please wake me up at 5:30. Gave it to his wife. His wife looks at it, and she just nods. They're still not talking. They both kind of go to bed. He wakes up the next morning. His wife is not in the bed. He looks at the clock, and it's 9 o'clock. And he is so mad because she did not get him up at 5:30. And as he's getting into bed, he sees a sticky note that says, it's 5:30. You need to get up. Many troubles in the marriage relationship. But the many troubles is coming from the many distractions. The many troubles is coming from the many distractions. The way we live, the busyness of life, the kids, all that stuff around it. It distracts us from our spouse sometimes. Remember a few weeks ago when we were in the time, I said that the newest stuff out there says that we need to spend 15 hours of uninterrupted time with our spouse. And we're like, what? So time is key. But whenever we don't have time to spend, we keep getting distracted. It can even distract us from God. Marriage can distract us from God if we're not careful. That's what Paul says, 1 Corinthians 7:32. But I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. The idea that whenever we come to grips with the gospel of Jesus, that he died on the cross, that he was buried, that he rose on the third day, that he was seen, that he ascended to heaven, and he sat down as king of the universe, and one day he's coming again. When we kneel to the king, he becomes the focus and the priority of our life. And that should be priority one. Our relationship with God should trump our relationship with everyone else, including our spouse, including our kids, including our parents, including our friends. God has to be number one. And Paul is kind of magnifying this idea that sometimes when we get married, God is no longer number one. Verse 34, he repeats it this way. He says, an unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both the body and the spirit. He's teaching us that the key to life is the spiritual life. The key to life is the spiritual life. The key in your marriage life is the spiritual life. If you want to have a marriage that makes it till death do you part, both of you have to have a solid relationship with God, and it has to manifest itself in the marriage. She's focused on God. Husband's focused on God. And you grow together in that unity. That's the way it's supposed to work. Because Paul knew that when you get married, you get distracted. Verses 33 and 34 says, "But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. A married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband." Here's how we get distracted in marriage. Here's how marriage distracts us, or a family even distracts us. Number one, serving our spouse. Serving our spouse. I mean, when you think about priorities, 1, 2, and 3 in the Bible are clear. Priority number 1 for you is God. Priority number 2 is your spouse. Priority number 3 is your kids. And number 4 varies depending on who you are and where you're at in life. But 1, 2, and 3 are non-negotiable. That's the way it is supposed to work. But we get so dependent or codependent on someone else, we get distracted and we start focusing on someone as priority 1 other than God. Number 2 is just the kids. I mean, how many of us, our schedules revolve around our children and their activity and their business, and we allow that. And whenever they're being run ragged, we're being run ragged, you have a husband going this way, and you got a wife going this way, and a gap happens. And then we're so worried about the gap, we're so worried about pleasing the other person that we kind of forget about God sometimes. Number 3, not being fulfilled. This kind of goes together. Not being fulfilled, and then not having our needs met by the other. Whenever we kind of come together, the expectation we have is that this person is going to make me happy. This person is going to meet all my needs. And whenever that's not happening, the rifts start to occur. But it's amazing because these needs that are met, you've got the physical, you've got the emotional, you've got, all this other, the financial, but there's a spiritual need too, that you as a spouse are responsible to the person you are living the rest of your life with. And if you and Jesus aren't good, odds are your marriage isn't going to be good. How many of you have ever heard of the phrase, Damien, help me out because I said it wrong in the Daily Service, the doppelgangers?
Yeah, the
doppelgangers. Doppelgangers are like whenever two people look alike and they're really not related. Like they have absolutely no reason to look alike, but they do. Okay? So there's some celebrity doppelgangers. This is Ed Sheeran. Now here's the weird thing. I don't know which one's the real Ed Sheeran. Jason, he's a big Ed Sheeran fan. He doesn't even know either. Is the left one the one on the left is the right one, the one on the right is the one? Okay. So you got that kind of doppelganger. Now sometimes as we go through life, we encounter some doppelganger moments. Doppelganger, I said it right. Doppelganger moments. I get it wrong the whole time. Sometimes you can just be a lot alike someone and they'll say, hey, you're kind of alike. I'll never forget, this was last couple of years whenever I was working at Chick-fil-A, the kitchen crew. Joel, you're a preacher. Yeah, I'm a preacher. And you used to like wrestling, right? Yeah, wrestling. Lucha Libre. Yeah. Listen, you are Nacho Libre. So I was kind of like Nacho Libre, which is true because I actually own like the Mexican wrestling mask. That's part of the stuff I was wearing it the other day. It's just the way it works for me. So that's a tough thing. Sometimes you can model yourself after someone in the hopes of looking like them, intentional or unintentional. So confession time, bad influence in Pastor Joel's life. Like high school, college. I loved professional wrestling. My favorite wrestler for at least 4 years was Stone Cold Steve Austin. And it was amazing that whenever I started losing my hair, look who I kind of look like. Look at that. Jay said I didn't. I'm like, no, I kind of look like him. We got to pass on. We got to look. Now, the other side of this is most bald guys look identical. That's just the way it works over the course of time. Now, whenever we moved here, 2010, 2011, I had at least 11 people tell me I look like the lead singer of the Smashing Pumpkins, Billy Corgan. Jay said that one was kind of close. If you're the right way, there it is. Sometimes, though, you can even dress alike, and people might call you twinsies. This was a few years ago. Look at that. Let's just go the way it works. Or you might influence someone to the point that they accidentally one day just show up looking like you. Look at this one. Look at Mr. Goldforth right there. You never know. But here's the deal. Whenever we're in the marriage relationship, do you know who your spouse should see? They should see Jesus. They should see Jesus. Husbands, love your wife like Christ loved the church. Your spouse should see Jesus in you. And when they don't, it causes a distraction. I've had so many couples where one of them stopped attending church because their spouse was not acting like Jesus. And because their spouse, who professed to be a follower of Jesus, was not, a gap was created. And they were supposed to see God through their spouse. And if God acted like their spouse, they didn't want to have anything to do with God. It happens all the time. But the design is our spouse should see Jesus through us. This is the point Paul makes in verse 35. He says, okay, I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you. And this is, talking about sex. But that you may live in a right way in an undivided devotion to the Lord. You may live in a right way in an undivided devotion to the Lord, whether you are single or married. Here's the point. Here's the lesson. We can please our mate and the Lord when we yield to Jesus and obey the Word. We can please our mate and the Lord when we yield to Jesus and obey the Word. Here's how. There's 4 ways we can have undistracted, undivided attention in our marriage relationships. Number 1, marry or don't marry for God. Marry or don't marry for God. Like when you're thinking about, should I spend the rest of my life with this person? Ask yourself this question. Can they help me serve Jesus better? Can they help me serve Jesus better? And if the answer is no, don't marry them. Marry or don't marry for God. Number 2, learn from your failures to love well. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get married, and the person you marry is going to disappoint you. I'll put money on it. And then you are going to disappoint that person. I will put money on it, even though maybe that's a sin. Maybe I shouldn't do that. But here's the thing. Learn from your mutual disappointments. Learn from your mutual disappointments to love better, to love well. Number 3, learn to serve. This should actually start before you're married. But learn to serve God. Don't let marriage isolate you. Here's what happens whenever you start dating. You start spending all your time with that person. You're going on dates. You're processing, how can I make this person want to hang out with me more? And then after 2 or 3 weeks, you see your buddies and they go, I never see you anymore. It's okay to have outside relationships as long as those outside relationships are healthy. But they have to be healthy. Number 5, be a married disciple. Be a married disciple. If you are following Jesus the way you're supposed to, and your spouse is following Jesus the way they are supposed to, you'll have a marriage that makes it till death do us. Paul kind of begins this section in verse 32 and he says, I want you to be free, from anxieties. I want you to be free from anxieties. And then it's kind of funny because he goes through this chapter and he says, okay, if you're single, you're going to have anxiety from trying to serve God. If you're married, you're going to have anxiety because you're going to try to please your spouse. So why would he even say, I want you to be free from anxieties? Because he knows that Jesus answers all our anxieties. Jesus answers all our anxieties. No matter problem, addiction, issue we have in our life, Jesus is always the answer when we cast our care upon him because he cares for us and loved us enough to die for us. When we get that right, individually and as a couple, making it to death do us part, still going to have some issues, but the likelihood is way higher. Let's pray. Father, we pray that you would empower us to live out the disciple-making process with the person we spend the rest of our life with. Give us focus, discipline, and attentiveness so that we can have a relationship that is a picture of Jesus and the church. We love you and we praise you in Jesus' name.